Welcome, everyone. We know you're with us from all over the world. I'm Catherine Amirfar, President of the American Society of International Law. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the opening plenary of the Society's 115th annual meeting. This is also our second all-virtual annual meeting, and the annual meeting committee and our staff have been working for many months to make it a memorable experience. With that, let me call the meeting officially to order with our Society gavel. The 2021 annual meeting theme, Reconceiving International Law, Creativity in Times of Crisis, will provide a forum for critical thinking about the future of international law. Over the next 3 days, you'll have the opportunity to engage with thought leaders in international law and related disciplines through more than 50 substantive sessions and 6 thematic tracks, as well as special interactive sessions designed especially for this year's virtual format. I'd like to begin by recognizing the extraordinary work of the co-chairs of this annual meeting, Simone Badafor, Christy Edwards, and Darren Johnson, and all the members of their committee. They truly rose to the occasion. They have assembled a remarkable program, and I know you join me in thanking them for their hard work and ingenuity. I'm also delighted to announce the co-chairs of the 2022 annual meeting, which will take place on April 6th through 9th. They are Rachel Lopez, Kish Perella, and Patrick Pearsall. I congratulate them and look forward to working with them over the coming months. As we all know, it would not have been possible to produce this annual meeting without the commitment and dedication of our staff at Tiller House, under the leadership of our Executive Director, Mark Agrast, and our Deputy Executive Director, Weiss. I can't say enough about how much they contribute to the work of the Society. At this point, we would normally ask all members of Tiller House to rise and be recognized. Although we can't do so today, we put their names and photos on the screen. I know you join me in expressing our deep appreciation to them for all the extraordinary work that they do and the countless sleepless nights that have accompanied putting on this meeting. We have just come out of a year unlike any other, at least in our lifetimes. We've heard the word unprecedented a lot over the past year as we bore witness to a pandemic, economic upheaval and dislocation on a global scale, a polarizing US election leading to a vicious attack on the US Capitol building, and movements for racial justice and equity taking place all over the world. Many have endured isolation as we were forced to retreat to virtual worlds. Indeed, Richard Haas recently called it the year of living separately. But I submit that in another very important sense, our shared experience of the uncertainty and upheaval unfolding around us has also pulled us together as institutions, associations, companies, NGOs alike have been sustained by the energy and resilience of their members. The Society is an institution dedicated to justice and defending the global rule of law has felt the benefit of an extraordinary cadre of individuals. You, our members, who have stepped up at every turn when we have needed you most. As many of you know, we broke all previous registration records last year with our inaugural virtual annual meeting. Rather unbelievably, we've now broken that previous all-time high with our registrations for this, our second virtual meeting. So thank you for all that you do for the Society, for helping the Society fulfill its mandate since its founding 115 years ago, to create a robust forum for the discussion of international law and international affairs. And while we are indeed an American society, our society and our members thankfully span the globe, drawing on a nonpartisan basis from the very best of academia, government, the judiciary, private practice, international institutions, and civil society from nearly every country. And we are really blessed in that respect. I said a year ago, and I repeat it now because I have seen us tested by virtue of who we are and what we do, the Society's potential for shaping the discourse with respect to international law is almost boundless. Whatever our experiences of the past year, there appears to be general agreement that we are at a pivotal moment in world affairs. At this moment, it's especially important for us to come together as a global community to think about the challenges ahead. This year's theme was carefully chosen to reflect these times in the sense of asking us to reconceive international law through the lens of creativity in times of crisis. The fundamental question posed in the myriad subject matters to be addressed during this annual meeting, whether it's climate change or artificial intelligence or cyber attacks, is what reconceiving means. Are we, as a global community, benefited by preserving the existing international legal order and institutions, or by moving to a new legal order that better reflects the values of today, or by landing somewhere in between? These are questions of first principles, and we'll explore them with you over the course of this week. In many instances, I think we will find that we look back to move forward. I hope you come away from the discussions had during this annual meeting with a sense of your power to act, to promote the rule of law in your community and in your way. This opening plenary will begin our engagement with these issues as we start with some society traditions and then move to our keynote, David Miliband, the International Rescue Committee, and finally a special treat in convening a presidential roundtable, some of our brightest stars to discuss the Society's role in today's world. So now I'd like to turn to some of our tried and true traditions of the Society. I first would like to call to mind the members of the Society whom we have lost since our last annual meeting. Their names and images will appear on your screen as I read their names aloud. Jean B. Fissler, Brian C. Murphy, George Pavia, Horace B. Robertson Jr., Daniel Ulmer, and Lucius Wildhaber. Please join me in a moment of silence as we remember them, together with all the victims and survivors of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you. We now turn to a joyous occasion, the recognition of this year's emeritus members. Emeritus members are those who've been members of the Society for at least 50 years and are entitled to all the privileges of membership without further payment of dues. This year, we recognize 15 members who've attained that exalted status. This is a truly illustrious list and includes some of our most cherished members. I'll read the list of the 2021 emeritus members as their names appear on your screen. Gerald Axon, Talat Aguneni, Carl Arnold, Franklin Berman, John Boyd, Henry Burmester, Peter Hutchins, Larry Johnson, Patrice Lyons, Ted Marone, James Michel, Hans-Peter Neuhold, Joseph Roach, Jonathan Russin, and George Taft. Congratulations to our new emeritus members. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. David Miliband is President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, where he oversees the agency's humanitarian relief operations in more than 40 war-affected countries and its refugee resettlement and assistance programs in 25 US cities across the country. David previously served as the 74th Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, as Secretary of State for the Environment, and a Member of Parliament for South Shields. He graduated from Oxford University with first-class honors in philosophy, politics, and economics, and received a master's degree in political science from MIT, which he attended as a Kennedy Scholar. David will discuss what governments, civil society, and the legal profession can do to combat the global rise in impunity. I'm delighted to welcome him to deliver our opening keynote to talk about what he has termed an age of impunity. David, over to you.
Hello. I'm very grateful indeed to the American Society of International Lawyers for honoring me with the invitation to speak to you today. These are obviously very unusual circumstances. I'm speaking to you from my wife's study in the Upper West Side of New York. Fortunately, my kids are at school at the moment, but COVID has turned all of our worlds upside down, and I hope that in the next 20 minutes or so I can reach you, albeit not in a physical form, but in a virtual one. The International Rescue Committee, which is the organization that I'm proud, honored to lead, is an international humanitarian organization that probably should have more to do with the legal world than it currently does. We have some important partnerships here in New York and elsewhere to support our work, but it's very gratifying to be able to have the chance to talk a bit about the intersection of international humanitarian law and the humanitarian enterprise itself. The organization has an extraordinary history. It was founded by Albert Einstein in the 1930s to help rescue Jews and intellectuals from Europe. Our first employee was in a safe house in Marseille in 1940, 41, 42, helped 2,000 people escape from Nazi-occupied Europe with fake passports, including people like Marc Chagall, who was brought to the United States thanks to the International Rescue Committee. And today we work in 200 field sites, 40 countries, where war, conflict, persecution pervade the lives of too many people, and where outside help is needed. And we're also the largest refugee resettlement agency in the United States, working in 25 cities across the country, helping new arrivals into the United States become patriotic and productive citizens through effective integration into national and local life. We have about 13,000 employees and 17,000 incentive workers, day staff who commit to us, often refugees themselves. And we are unusual in various ways among NGOs in that we've got a very clear focus. We're not a general anti-poverty organization. We are an organization which helps people whose lives are shattered by conflict, disaster, and persecution survive, recover, and gain control of their lives. And so the circumstances that they come from are those where law, and especially international law, is often being broken, and where the assertion of their rights is something that seems a long way off. And in the best of circumstances, our clients would benefit from international law, from the international laws in which you specialize, but they can only benefit if those laws are applied. And the theme that I'm going to discuss today is the fact that those laws are not being consistently applied. Impunity, actions without consequence or punishment, are too often the order of the day in the places that we work. Accountability is unusual rather than the norm, so much so that I talk about an age of impunity. And that's really what I want to talk about today. And I'm going to make 4 points to you, just to give you a sense of the guideposts to take you through the next 20 minutes or so. The first is that the places where we work are seeing increasing need, but also increasing impunity from state and non-state actors. There are more people displaced by war and persecution than any time since records began, since the Second World War. 45 million internally displaced, 35 million crossing borders as refugees or as asylum seekers. They are displaced for longer than ever before. Less than 3% of the world's refugees went home last year. They live in urban areas rather than in camps. It's a myth that they're all in camps. 60% of refugees are in urban areas, not in camps. They're in Beirut, they're in Istanbul, they're in Kampala. They're in the main not in camps, although there are large numbers in the Rohingya refugee camp in Bangladesh. In the north of Uganda, there is an important refugee camp called Bidi Bidi for South Sudanese refugees. About 4 or 5 million refugees in total are in camps. And the names that I've given you give you one important other facet of the refugee experience, which is that contrary to some of what you read or hear in the media, most refugees are in poor countries, not in rich countries. They're in 88%, more or less, 86% are in countries that are poor or lower middle income. Now, need is increasing. We publish every year an emergency watch list of 20 countries where we foresee rising humanitarian need. Those countries we published this year in January, the 2021 watch list, shows something remarkable. These countries account for 10% of the world's population, but nearly 90% of humanitarian need. In total, there's 235 million people in humanitarian need around the world. 200 million or so are in those 20 countries. And here's the point that starts off the argument I'm making to you today, that the post-World War II pioneers envisioned that international law would be a lever to improve the lives of the most vulnerable. And few could be more vulnerable than those without a state of their own, without a home of their own, and therefore refugees. The idea was that international law would protect civilians in war, and that international law would serve as a check on the abuse of power. The great leaders of the post-World War II generation understood or learned that the old adage that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely is a cliche because it's true. Now, this legal regime of international humanitarian law, of international conventions on human rights and on refugees, the conventions on the rights of the child, conventions and laws that you probably know better than I do, it's in retreat in the places that we work. Every day, our aid workers face the risk of assault and intimidation, the risk that our facilities will be bombed and our clients are attacked, and our clients face those risks as well. Just to get this in perspective, 70% of the world's victims of conflict today are civilians, not combatants. The number of civilians being killed in war and conflict is double the average of 5 years ago and 7 times the average of 2008. About 120 aid workers were killed last year. That's 4 or 5 times the level in the early 2000s. And places like Syria are the avatar of this crisis. Just to take the example of health facilities, which are a prime example of what should be protected by international humanitarian law, supposedly sacrosanct, 595 attacks on health facilities from the air over the last 10 years of the conflict, including 27 cases where the coordinates of those health facilities were notified to the United Nations and thereby to the combatants, the Assad regime and its Russian supporters who have control of the air. They were notified of these health facilities in the so-called deconfliction system that exists, but were bombed nonetheless. A quite remarkable International Rescue Committee survey from a couple of weeks ago showed that fully 81% of the health workers that we surveyed in the northwest and northeast of Syria had said that they had a co-worker or a patient injured or killed in an attack. And a staggering 68% said that they'd been inside a health facility when it had been attacked. This is impunity. And my point to you is that while Syria is an avatar, it's not unusual. Yemen, Ethiopia, Myanmar are all examples where the international humanitarian or international law is observed in breach, is honored in the breach, not in the observance. And so that's the first point, that we're seeing need, and need is being driven by impunity. Second, I think it's important to understand that acts of impunity are supported by systems of impunity and cultures of impunity. And the sad fact of the last decade is that those acts, systems, and cultures have not been challenged in anything like the most appropriate or effectively robust way. The trend that I've highlighted is not confined to a few rogue nations or a few isolated incidents. It's the product of shifts in the balance of power. Within liberal democracies, as the scholar at Stanford University says, there's democratic recession across the world, and all types of regime are becoming less liberal, less adherent to in laws respecting individual rights. But the international system has also shifted against the post-Cold War, the post-war rules, and the post-Cold War order that some said would be the end of history. Sadly, has been no such thing. Worth spending, I think, a minute or two just on the idea of acts of impunity, systems of impunity, and cultures of impunity. Acts of impunity are easy to understand. The Saudi bombing of a school bus of 43 children in northern Yemen, the use of chemical weapons by President Assad. These are acts which violate not just laws and norms, or not just norms, but also laws as well. And then, critically, they're subject to no punishment and no accountability. These acts, I think it's important to understand, are enabled by systems of impunity which protect those who commit these acts, and cultures which encourage them. I think systems of impunity are formal or informal structures that enable acts of impunity. Military rules of engagement, for example, that gloss over international humanitarian law. The denial of investigatory powers to bodies designated to police obedience to the laws. Political coalitions for whose side you're on is more important than the legality of your operations. Cultures of impunity, by complement, are informal nods and winks that condone or even glorify misbehavior. It's these systems and cultures which give modern power to the insight about the corruption of power that I referred to earlier. And these cultures are obviously not confined within government, they're part of wider society. Now, we could spend the whole time talking about the origins of this trend, the shift within liberal democracies in the terms of political trade, towards, in some eyes or in some mouths or in some acts, the idea that the law is for suckers, which is a dangerous trend, but also globally, the shift in the global balance of power. I think I'm right in saying that 2019 was the first year in which, in 100, in which the global cumulative GDP of autocratic countries outstripped that of the Western liberal democracies. But whatever the origins, what we know is that the response has been fragmented where it needed to be unified. There has been erosion in the standards within liberal democratic countries that are supposed to be upholding the higher standards of law. Erosion, not example. There have been silos in thinking, not integration of thinking about the response and the promotion of accountability. And there's been a shrugging of the shoulders rather than a taking of responsibility. And it was encouraging to me in late 2019 when President Macron devoted part of his UN General Assembly speech to the idea that taking on the age of impunity was a responsibility. But the arrival of the COVID crisis has blown away the incipient interest, and I hope that I can interest you in the importance of this work in the kind of places where we have our operations. Third, I do so cognizant that obviously there's a new administration in the United States, and it is significant, I think, that the trope of the Trump administration that the law was for suckers should have been replaced by a commitment on the part of the new president to push back against the erosion of democracy at home and the abuse of human rights and international law abroad. And I just want to say a few things about how to conceive of that project, because it's challenging, to put it mildly, but I think that how it's framed really matters. And I take inspiration in thinking about the framing of the renewal of commitment to international law and accountability in the work, or in the concept that was developed and popularized in the 1950s by John Kenneth Galbraith. He wrote a book called American Capitalism, The Case for Countervailing Power. And he was speaking about the American economy and the need to countervail the power of the giant corporations. I think we need to take that notion of countervailing power and apply it outside the economic realm. It would be good to apply it inside, but that's not really my focus today. And use that notion of countervailing power to think about how to push back against impunity at the international level. We need to apply, in other words, the idea of countervailing power to build acts, systems, and cultures, or maybe more appropriately, cultures, systems, and acts of accountability that can push back against the incentives for impunity. A foreign policy determined to build up countervailing power could, I think, thread a needle between what might seem like the grandiosity or grandiloquence or simplisticness of the quote-unquote democracy promotion agenda of the early 2000s, and on the other hand, the overly technocratic agenda that says merely that pushing back against mass atrocities is the way forward. President Bush launched the freedom agenda in the early 2000s, but many studies denote 2005 as the time when the freedom agenda went actually into reverse internationally. President Obama set up the Atrocities Prevention Board after he was elected in 2008 and took office in 2009. But that became an exercise of a committee in Washington, not something that was weighing on the minds of combatants in Syria or elsewhere. And I think the idea of an accountability promotion agenda could provide a binding thread for the desire of the new Biden administration to think about unifying the liberal democratic world in a project that was inclusive rather than exclusive, and which allowed for engagement with other parts of the world rather than a Cold War against them. If that agenda for promoting accountability is to have life, if it's to take the idea of countervailing power and apply it productively, then I think it does need to work politically. It needs to think about how political peer pressure is applied. It needs to be applied using economic instruments. It can't just be for governments. It's going to have to take public-private partnership to raise standards of accountability. It's going to have to ask and demand of our own militaries that they don't just stand up for the highest standards of international law themselves, but they use the peer-to-peer engagement that they have with many militaries around the world to promote that accountability to international humanitarian law. And where, in cases like Syria, where there are American troops, that 1,000 in the northeast, that they do hold the ring for adherence to international humanitarian law. That countervailing power needs to be cultural. It needs to apply in such a way that there is cultural pressure as well as political and economic and military pressure for adherence to international humanitarian law. But it also needs to be legal. And I want to spend my last few minutes just talking a little bit about how, from our point of view at the International Rescue Committee, from outside the legal world, you can help. Because I'd like to think that there is a partnership to be built. We obviously treat the symptoms of an unraveling international order. And my message or my plea is to rally your help in defending and restoring the regime of individual rights that was so important to the unprecedented period of peace and prosperity after 1945, during the Cold War, even during the Cold War, but also which was glimmering with hope after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s and the early 2000s. I often say that the liberal international order, so-called, should be thought of as such, or should be described as liberal in the sense that it established individual rights alongside the rights of states in international law. It was international in that it gathered all countries, communist and capitalist, democratic and autocratic, within its remit. And it also was an order in that it established institutions to police the adherence to those laws. Today, the danger of the liberal international order is it's decreasingly liberal, decreasingly international, and decreasingly in order. And I think we have to fight that. The safety and security of my teams around the world depends on our success. And as we think about the role of a body of, I think, 3,500 lawyers, I think I read in the background documents, the American Society of International Law and Lawyers, four things come to mind that I hope you'll consider as you go away from this talk. One is obviously that there's no strength of rule of law abroad if there isn't the strength of the rule of law at home, and upholding the principles of your own constitution and democratic system is absolutely fundamental to America playing a rallying, benchmarking role around the world. Secondly, I hope that you individually, through your firms, but also institutionally, will push your own government to uphold its international commitments. We've been appalled by some of the transgressions that we've seen in recent years. And we need to win this battle, not just in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. I'm not an American, as you can tell from my accent. I come from the UK. I live and work in New York, where the International Rescue Committee is located. And often I see strength in the recourse to law to defend the rights of individuals. Of course, I would say that. But there's also a danger in thinking that the courtroom can do it on its own. And I think the court of public opinion matters. We face today internationally an attempt to reassert that the sovereignty of states should be the sole determinant of the legality of actions within a nation state. But that seems to me to be the route to the law of the jungle. We need to show why international law is not a straitjacket on national sovereignty, but instead the scaffolding upon which nations can build a more stable, just, and prosperous future in which the sovereignty of states is respected, but so are the rights of individuals as established in the UN Charter after 1945 and its associated conventions. Third, I would hope that you individually, institutionally, can help support the efforts of organizations like the International Rescue Committee, in particular in our legal work, to promote the legal rights of people around the world, which we do. For example, in Iraq, we have a team of Iraqi lawyers who are working around the clock to get citizenship papers for families who were living under ISIS rule and now face the prospect of proving, or now face the reality, they have to prove that they're not ISIS sympathizers. By getting them documentation, our lawyers allow them to receive financial aid from the government, prove their ownership of property, ensure their children can get to school. That's the kind of legal work that we do around the world. So in addition to the kind of pro bono support that we sometimes get from American law firms, we'd love to have your support for our international legal work. And obviously, fourthly, I come back to our clients, refugees and asylum seekers arriving in this country who seek the backing of litigation to protect their legal rights, and our clients, refugees and asylum seekers around the world who seek the support of the global community of lawyers with the desire or demand that their human rights be observed. We've seen some tremendous examples of that in the US over the last few years. We need to see more of it here, but we also need to see it abroad. I really appreciate the chance to talk to you. I hope I haven't abused my time. It looks like I've gone on for 2 or 3 minutes more than ideal, but I'm very grateful for the chance to talk with you. I hope you'll visit our website, www.rescue.org, and I hope that if there are ways that you institutionally, as the American Society of International Law, or through your individual law firms, whether in the US or around the world, would be interested in supporting our work, you'll do that through the website, or you'll email me, david.miliband@rescue.org. With that, thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you have a successful rest of conference. Goodbye from New York.
Thank you, David, for your eloquent remarks, your powerful call to action, and stating the case so well for the partnership to be built with legal institutions. It's now my pleasure to introduce a very special roundtable that brings together 4 of my distinguished predecessors as president of the Society. Taken together, their terms of office span the last 25 years. Edith Brown Weiss is a university professor at Georgetown University Law Center. Jose Alvarez is the Herbert and Rose Rubin Professor of International Law at New York University School of Law. Lucinda A. Lowe is partner at Steptoe & Johnson LLP, where she heads the Compliance, Investigations, Trade, and Enforcement Department. And Sean D. Murphy is the Manat An Professor of International Law at George Washington University Law School and a member of the UN International Law Commission. Welcome, welcome. Our topic is a variation on the theme of this annual meeting, Reconceiving the Society's Role in a Time of Crisis. I've asked each of our past presidents to think about the role of the society during their presidency and today. And hopefully we can get a raucous discussion going. Knowing these four, I have no doubt that we will. So again, welcome. I want to start with a bit of a table setting question to just get us going and thinking about the society's role. But let me ask you to begin. What were your aspirations for the society's role when you first took on the presidency? And did that change during your tenure? So on that one, let me start with Edie.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I want to take you back 1994 to 1996. And one of my key goals was to expand our relationship with other societies of international law, which we did with the first trilateral meeting between Japan, Canada, and the United States, an initiative which was actually started by Peter Treboff. Meetings with the Dutch Society of International Law, developing programs with the French Society of International Law and with other societies of international law around the world. I thought it was very important to have these relationships, to strengthen the ASIL, but also to collaborate with others so that we could mutually reinforce each other and learn from each other. The second aspiration was to continue a strong research program, which we did with funding from the Ford Foundation and from the National Science Foundation, and symposium and work on compliance with non-binding legal instruments, sometimes called soft law, which is relevant now. The third aspiration was to have it more inclusive of different interests and different people. And that involved expanding the interest groups, which went from a few to 21 in 1995, and specifically expanding the participation of women, which again, for the first time, we had co-chairs of an annual meeting. Before that, it was one chair. And we had two women as co-chairs, Laurie Damrosch and then Ruth Wedgwood. But more importantly, to integrate women and to encourage them to participate. And finally, a focus on outreach, which at that time was primarily directed to outreach to the judiciary with a newsletter to state federal judges and efforts to build a capacity for international law within that. And I might add, finally, attention to the International Law Students Association, because young people were then and still remain our future. In terms of how things went during the course of that, I've outlined a number of things. One always has to pay attention to financial issues. We need stability, and we need sound financial footing. And the other thing is to realize that you cannot accomplish everything in 2 years. But what you can do is to have a number of things that get going and to hopefully send a signal and set the foundation for work that others can then carry out later. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, Edie. And it's funny how much of that echoes with some of the themes that are currently going on. And can I just say that you are a shining light for women like me in terms of participation in the society. So personally, thank you for walking that walk, because you made it all possible for so many of us. Jose, let me turn to you with the same question.
So it may be odd for an internationalist to say this, but my aspirations when I sought the presidency were patriotic. I, as an immigrant, grateful to a country that gave me asylum, I wanted to give back, and I saw the society as an essential part of the country's aspirations to being that shining city on the hill that Reagan talked about for not just its own people, for people around the world. And I saw the society as a beacon for a country that, at its best, respects the rule of law and seeks to encourage other states to do the same. And I modeled myself on another immigrant former president of the society, whose office I occupy and whose books surround me, and that's Tom Frank. And he also saw the society, I think, the same way, as a prod to the country's better nature, its international law of conscience. And I used my presidential columns, and sometimes got in trouble for them, the way Tom did, including to remind the country, the US government in particular, of its better angels, when many of our members and including myself, thought it was falling short in adhering to international law, as it sometimes did in the wake of 9/11 and the so-called war on terror. I saw that the society then, as now, is a learned society, but one that has a moral obligation to be a force for good. And this means, I think, reaching out to the general public to show that international law matters, as Lucinda Lowe had done with her 100 Ways on the 100th anniversary of the society, which happened just when I was taking office. But it also means talking frankly to our fellow international law acolytes and believers, and to warn them of hubris, as I did in my presidential speech and my accompanying a list that I hope Lucinda never took offense to, which was the 50 ways international law hurts our lives. The society, it seems to me, then and now, does best when it reflects this yin and yang of international law. Its apologetic side, when it apologizes for state action, but as well as its more utopian aims. As Koskiniemi would say, we are most credible, I think, when we tell the truth, indicating when international law falls short and needs to be, as the theme of this annual meeting suggests, be reconceived. In terms of the goals, I don't think the goal that I had or the aspirations that I had for the society changed, but the means did a bit because of some of the things that Edie teed up. I was also part of a time when the society sought the outreach beyond the East Coast of the US and more globally. It needed to diversify and enrich its perspectives, and it coincided with continuation of the outreach that Edie described to other societies of international law, including the European, Asian societies, and eventually the African societies, joined programs with all of them. And through the initiative of the late David Caron, it began organizing on the West Coast of the US. This is all to say that the society can be an American society, but it need not only reflect East Coast elites' views of international law.
Thank you, Jose. Lucinda, that segues nicely to you, from 100 ways to 50 ways. Love to hear your thoughts.
Well, let me say first, thank you, Catherine, for this opportunity. And I was president in 2016 to 2018, and this discussion really shows how we can build on the work of our predecessors, because I came in at a time when the society had already become much more open and inclusive in many ways than it was when I first became a member. The comments by Jose about the 100 ways really laid the groundwork for what I ended up focusing on principally during my presidency, and that was to increase the external impact of the society's work, both by educating the public about international law. And no, Jose, I do not resent the 50 ways. I welcomed and embraced it. But also to increase our engagement with key stakeholders in the international system. I came into the presidency at the very beginning of the Trump administration, and there was a sense in our membership that the domestic order, the international order was shifting under us. And our membership didn't want us to take positions on day-to-day issues very much, but they did want us to make our voices heard, be out there, trying to have an impact on the dialogue. And my presidency had been, the table had been set by a strategic planning exercise that you know about very well, Catherine, that really had brought a number of us together and yielded a consensus on the importance of the society's role as a convener, as a trusted set of voices. And so one of the things we ended up doing as part of that outreach goal was to launch a series of webcasts, which again, you know well, on the Trump administration and international law, while at the same time trying to increase our engagement with key stakeholders, government, international organizations, NGOs, business, and to continue to support initiatives like the judicial initiative that Edith mentioned. I would say these goals didn't change fundamentally during my term. Although the modalities have evolved, we've learned what's most effective in the current environment, and the issues of focus changed. But during my tenure, the fundamental aspirations did not.
Thank you, Lucinda. We're hearing definitely some themes of increasing external impact. We're hearing some themes of the Trump administration and situating society. Sean, over to you as my most recent predecessor. You obviously came in with a full deck. What were your aspirations? How did they change, if at all?
Well, to a certain extent, well, first of all, thank you, Catherine, for the invitation to be here. And it's great to see all these wonderful faces. And it looks like our annual meeting's off to a great start. So much like Lucinda, I would say that the Trump administration was very much looming as I became president. It wasn't just a sense that things were shifting, as Lucinda put it, in the outset of her presidency, but very much things had shifted and were continuing to shift. So I would say my aspiration was to make sure that the society was fully engaged on those issues. I think we're all familiar to a certain extent with them, but, pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement, pulling out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, pulling out of the Open Skies Treaty, ending the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, pulling out of the World Health Organization, pulling out of UNESCO, imposing sanctions on the prosecutorial staff of the International Criminal Court, continued efforts to stymie the work of the appellate body of the WTO, which didn't start under the Trump administration, but continued to a point where it basically is non-functional. All those things are happening, during my presidency, and consequently, as Lucinda was saying, just a sense that the society needed to be engaged on these issues, needed to be speaking to them. As Lucinda indicated, we don't take a position usually on one way or the other, but we do view it as our role to try to uphold the rule of law in international law and promote international law and institutions. And obviously, this felt like a frontal assault on the kinds of things that members of the society care about. So how does one address that? I think we continue to do some of the things that we normally do, annual meeting, mid-year meetings, and so on. But I tried to look for ways that we might tackle some of these issues in a more targeted fashion. So a couple examples would be launching the signature topic on climate change, which we're now in full throttle on and is going to do fantastic stuff. Forming the task force on the U.S. relationship with the International Criminal Court, which also was a way of bringing together voices from across the aisle, people who had experience with the court, people who had experience in U.S. government, non-governmental actors, bring them to the table to try to wrestle with what are clearly some difficult issues about how to engage with the court. And so on. So looked for ways to leverage the strength of the society as a convening organization to do that. I feel like that continued throughout my time in presidency. I suppose the other thing I did focus on, although it's a bit more behind the doors, was financial stability. We are a society that relies on the fabulous staff that we have at Tiller House, maintaining our headquarters, running all the different programs. That takes resources. It takes financial resources, and we're blessed to have a membership that largely supports these activities. But we have to look for other ways to fund things. So getting support from the Open Societies Foundation to do the ICC task force, for example, is something that we had to make happen. Or running the first gala event that we did in New York at the Frick Museum, which was not just raising funds, it was also bringing people together, and it was hearing from some leading lights in the field, Brad Smith of Microsoft, Amal Clooney of the Clooney Foundation. It was a programmatic thing, but it was also a means of us perhaps bringing about financial resources that we need to do what we do. And so I continue to do things like that, the David Caron Fund in honor of David Caron, which helps support young scholars to travel to the mid-year meeting now, as well as a prize in David Caron's name. Things like that I felt important to try to build up as targeted ways of doing even better what we were already doing. Thanks.
Thank you, Sean. And I hear really in all of your remarks already some of the challenges and some of the opportunities and how you dealt with them. But let me pivot to something that you all touched upon, but I want to focus on, which is how does the society make a difference? How should we be relevant to the most pressing issues of international law and policy of the day? Jose, let me start with you on that all important question.
So, well, one of the things it does is, as Sean mentioned, engage in the top issues. And during my presidency, that issue came to the forefront actually right before when I was president-elect. The society tried to support saying some things in a resolution. It divided the society quite a bit. There was an initiative brought together by a number of people to have a resolution on how international law applies in the so-called war on terror. And both sides argued passionately very different views of the society. One side saw the need to keep the society completely above politics, and the second believed that the society needed, on at least rare occasions, to take a stand lest its credibility be damaged by silence. Eventually, by the smallest of margins, the Executive Council approved a resolution initially drafted by a small group led by Mary Ellen O'Connell, and we also approved changes to the Society's regs that set out procedures for the taking of future resolutions under very strict circumstances. I listened to all sides as president-elect, but along with Tom Frank, I voted in favor of the resolution, and I'm proud of what we said then. We upheld the basic values of not only international law, but of the US, but I'm also pleased that the changes to the Society's regs, as far as I can tell, has not split the society or politicized it, and there have not been many resolutions. But let me get a bit personal on what the Society's means. That is, how does it make a difference? The Society has made an enormous difference, just to me. So Barack Obama said it best in his latest book. He explained his career in politics as, quote, really started with a search for a place to fit in, a way to explain the different strands of my mixed up heritage, and that it was only by hitching up my wagon to something larger than myself that I was ultimately able to locate a community and a purpose for my life. As someone whose parents never learned English, never graduated from high school, I found my scholarly mentors, my learned community in ASIL. I've been playing catch up my entire career, and I don't think my experience as something of an outsider to this American society is all that unique. I learned what it was to be an international lawyer by sneaking in, I'm embarrassed to say, not always as a paid participant, to the annual meeting, learning from Oscar Schachter, or being taught a lesson on my own sexist leanings and views of international law from Christine Chinkin. It's a great honor for me to have learned from these people, and I've been learning from them ever since, including from people on this panel, what it means to be a scholar, what it means to be a teacher. And when Edith took me aside in 1994, and as president encouraged me to become active in the Society, she opened up a whole world of professional associations that perhaps she never understood how it mattered to me. So that's how the Society makes a difference to individual lives. And it has given me far more than I have ever contributed to it.
Thank you, Jose, and thank you for that personal message. I think it'll be gratifying for lots of members to know that even Jose Alvarez felt like an outsider, at least at some point. But that mentorship and that community, and I would even call us a family, is something that is so important. But Edie, let me ask you the same question. How does the Society make a difference? How can we be relevant? How should we be relevant? You're muted.
Thank you, Catherine, and also thank you to Jose for those very, very kind words. I think the society needs to focus on reaching a broad audience, not just states and not just governmental actors. It really needs to focus on reaching non-state actors of all kinds, the private sector, and I would argue communities and individuals. And we can do that more easily now that we have information technology, and we can expand upon that. I think we need to stress norms, because if we're going to have what I've often called a kaleidoscopic world, then if we're going to bring people together, we're going to have some shared values and some shared norms. And I think that becomes important. Thirdly, we need to send a signal that breaches of international law or breaches of doing certain actions are not acceptable. And I want to commend our current president for the 2 statements that she has immediately issued on these issues, because it says the American Society of International Law is in the game, and we're sending a signal that some things are not acceptable. And finally, within our own society, and what the society can make a difference, is to be sure that all people feel comfortable who join the society, and as Jose said, can really see it for the future. And that means diversifying our membership. It means diversifying those who hold office. It means diversifying always those who are on the board of editors of the American Journal of International Law, so that we have a diverse and always welcoming atmosphere that Jose has so eloquently described.
Thank you, Edie. Obviously, really, really important themes. You know, the kaleidoscopic world that you describe of shared values and shared norms, and how that balances with the need to be nonpartisan and be inclusive across the spectrum of views. Very important for the society to grapple with. Lucinda, let me go over to you. Same question. How do we make a difference?
Thank you, Catherine. Well, the starting point for me has always been the mission of the society, and it's really worth reflecting on, because it's to educate about international law, and it's to promote international relations on the basis of law and justice. So it's a dual mission of education and the rule of law, as it were. And that's, as you think about it, really an activist agenda in a way. But I think we have to start with the society and its members, and we should never lose sight of our members, because that's we serve, as Jose eloquently observed, as a community for our members, as a place to come together, share ideas, to think about issues, to learn from each other, in an environment that puts a premium on quality and the integrity of the thinking process. And I think that's our bedrock. It's something we should never lose. And it becomes part of the common values we share. And so we need to nurture that. We need to preserve that. There are times when we need to come together as a community and express our outrage at the violation of those values. And I think we've struck the right balance in terms of how we approach policy decisions. As Jose said, they're not always easy. They can be, but I think everyone approaches them as a really values-based exercise that helps bridge sometimes differences of opinion. And that coming together as a community, in my view, also enables us to do our external work in furtherance of our mission. And there are many modalities for that. But I think it means that fundamentally that we need to be organizing ourselves to think about and identify what the key issues are of the day. And actually the kind of exercise we engaged in yesterday in the Executive Council is precisely an example of that. And then we have to go out, identify the key stakeholders, the communities with which we want to engage. As Edith said, it's not just state actors, it's not just governments, but I think we have to look at the range of diverse actors in the international system. We have to seek partnerships to expand our reach. And you know, we do wield an outsized influence, but we can wield it even more through strategic partnerships. I think those are never more important, frankly, than today. So that's how I think the society makes a difference. It has to be intentional, it has to be values-based, but our mission supports it and enables it and even encourages it. Catherine.
Thank you. I hear you, values-based and deliberate. Sean, what do you think? How are these themes manifesting in your mind?
Well, I think what the other three have said all hits it on the head. I guess I might just add that, like Jose said, the society is good for each individual member. You will get a lot out of it, and that's a fabulous thing. But it's also the case that the society allows us to leverage ourselves collectively in a manner that creates a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts, right? So, it allows us to each break out of our little silo where we're a professor or we're a student or we're a practitioner or a government official, where we're working on an international law matter, but it's probably relatively contained. It allows us to engage with others in a manner that enriches our own thinking about international law, as Jose was saying, but also allows us to do things that are bigger than what each of us individually might be able to do. So, when you join an interest group, you're creating the opportunity for events of one kind or another that go well beyond anything you as an individual might have been able to do. And the same for a task force or maybe a book project under the society's auspices or whatever. So, we're a place where people can meet, where we can convene groups to do bigger things than perhaps any one of us could do individually. And I think that's a pretty significant part of what the society is all about.
Thank you. And I certainly heard that theme throughout, and including maximizing the impact, making our tent bigger, and speaking not just to other experts, international lawyers, or even lawyers at all, but anyone interested in international law and policy. So let me ask you in our remaining minutes, just two basic questions. One, what keeps you up at night about the world today when it comes to international law and institutions? And to balance that out, also tell us what gives you hope going forward. Who wants to start us off on that one? Sean.
Well, one thing that's now going to keep me up is Jose's assertion that he didn't pay when he came to some April meetings. I'm really shocked about that, and I'm going to have some sleepless nights. But more seriously, there are clearly things that one needs to be concerned about. I think David Miliband hit one key issue on the head, which is atrocities happening worldwide, refugees, things of that sort. We live in a world where these things still exist, and the society needs to be finding ways to deal with it. We did have our signature topic on atrocity prevention. I think that's an important thing. I, in my capacity on the International Law Commission, have tried to developed articles on prevention and punishment of crimes against humanity. So I think that's a pretty big thing. I'd also say that, sleepless nights somewhat, or challenges somewhat from the success of international law. I think what we're in right now is a period of blowback where, because we have highly developed rules, highly sophisticated international institutions now, it's created a certain amount of pushback from various voices in various countries, including our own. And that presents a real challenge. But, when I think about, should we be hopeful in this regard? I think the answer is yes. And as I get older, the more I think that, because I look back to being a young child, told to hide under my desk at school because there might be a nuclear explosion, right? And you need to be, I don't know how that helps you in a nuclear explosion, but that's what they would tell us to do. Or, apartheid in South Africa, well entrenched, never going to go away. Or Cold War, right? East-West divide, wall up in Berlin. These things for a long time, as I'm growing up, it seemed like they would never change. And they all changed, right? The wall came down, the Cold War ended, apartheid ended in South Africa. Thankfully, no nuclear bombs have gone off, and it feels like they probably won't. So things can change, and we can change them. And so when you think about something like the Middle East being an intractable problem, well, it's not. It can be fixed. And a lot of these other things you're facing can be fixed as well. And so I'm hopeful that if it's not my generation, it's the next generation coming up. And I think the society is a great way of bringing those those two generations together.
Thank you, Sean. Beautifully put. Edie, over to you.
Very briefly, what keeps me up at night is worrying about climate change and the dangers of crossing tipping points, the possibility of nuclear war, new technologies with cyber threats, children, the status of children around the world, and the decline of the multilateral system and its institutions, and being shaken on by challenges to the rule of law and international law. But I do have hope. I think the kaleidoscopic system, while it poses lots of challenges, also gives hope, because it says that there are many actors, in addition to states and international organizations, cities, private sector, financial sector, communities, and individuals that can all act to begin to solve our problems. Secondly, I think there is capacity for innovation. We see that in technology, where very rapidly we have developed a variety of vaccines to address the pandemic, but we also see it in international law, where we've gone from just international agreements to soft law or non-binding legal instruments to now individualized voluntary commitments as witnessed in the Paris Agreement. And thirdly, I think climate change, there actually is some hope there, because there's a recognition for the first time that we share a common home, and that our lives and that of future generations are at stake, and that we do have to cooperate, and we do have to mobilize if we're going to do it, if we're going to redress it. And so we see judicial litigation happening in a variety of countries. We see actions at all levels now, including the financial sector. It's a recognition that we're locked in over time. And I think the development of a shared norm, that the only way we're going to get out of this is to have some cooperation. And finally, I just want to make sure that I make the pitch that for me, it's young people who are really the hope for the future and are going to be able to carry on in international law and in international institutions.
Thank you so much, Edie. And certainly the capacity for innovation is a big theme that we'll be exploring over the next 3 days as part of this annual meeting. And obviously the next generation, we need you, we want you, please be there. Jose, can I go over to you for this one?
Edie hit all the things that keep me up at night, echo anxieties to possibility of military miscalculations in the South China Sea or involving threats to Taiwan. But I guess I would just add one more sleepless issue, and that is the concern, the prospect that those responsible for governing here in the future or now or elsewhere will no longer respect the need for legal or scientific expertise, the need to distinguish fact from fiction. If we fail, if governments fail to consider to change that, we're more likely to fail to avert devastating war or climate change. But I do believe, as I think Edie also said, that the next generation is the product of a renaissance in ideas and has ever ready instantaneous access to, I hope, the best of them, not just to fake news on their phone. And they won't acquiesce in a QAnon-led return to the Middle Ages. So I do think that we need to take a quote that I think has been attributed to Churchill, and don't let a crisis go to waste. The current pandemic tells us we're all in this together. If we don't learn that we're in an interconnected world and that what ails China will reach us and vice versa, I don't think we'll ever learn. And so I do think that it's showing us that structural racism and inequities built into the very structures of our national and international rule of law need to be overcome. And I think that lesson will be learned so that perhaps in the future, the next pandemic, we won't ignore the fact that 100 countries or more are not having any vaccines, while 25% of our own population is already vaccinated. So I think we are learning lessons. We're learning lessons that civil and political rights and economic and social rights are, as the UN has always said, indivisible, and that the right to access to health is as important as the right to freedom of association or speech. So I think we can learn lessons from crisis. This very meeting will show us some of them. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jose. And indeed, I have heard that Churchill quote a time or two over the last year. And on the, interestingly, as you say, on the vaccine distribution and the equities in the fundamental system, we will be having Dr. Tedros joining us, the Director General of the World Health Organization, and have devoted the VATS Roundtable to precisely those issues. But thank you. So Lucinda, over to you to close us out. What keeps you up? What gives you hope?
Well, it's not Jose sneaking into the annual meeting, and I congratulate you on the Society's decision to let students participate in these virtual meetings for free, because that eliminates the issue entirely. But there are lots of things that keep me awake at night, and many have been mentioned. I'll highlight one that probably is my overarching concern. We've just been through a period in the United States that showed us how quickly institutions and practices we take for granted that bring good governance can be threatened and even fall away. And I've worked in many countries throughout my career where the rule of law is severely challenged, often as a result of corruption, weak institutions, and poor governance. And yet the challenges we've identified here, from the pandemic to climate change to refugees, are global challenges that require good governance globally. So I see this as a time of tremendous challenge to the world order. It's been in place since World War II. David Miliband talked about the international order diminishing on all elements. And I think with the changing power dynamics, the transition times we're in, it's a very tricky time. So that's what I worry about most. Martin Luther King talked about how the arc of the universe was uneven, but it bends towards justice. And it's something I think about a lot. And I think the arc of global governance is very uneven, but it does bend toward international cooperation. If you look as a whole, I look at what's happened in the last 10 to 15 years just on the corruption issue, a very hard issue, a very deep issue. And yet we have made progress. So that progress is what gives me hope. And I think the recognition, people will recognize, even if leaders don't, that there is a need for international cooperation. And organizations like the Society also give me hope. So good luck with this meeting, and we won't solve all the problems of the world, I'm sure, but we can work on them, and that's very worthwhile.
Thank you, Lucinda. Thank you for bringing us home so beautifully on that note. I just want to have everyone please join me in thanking all of you. You are inspirational to us all, and thank you for everything that you do for the Society and beyond. It's really just beautiful to see you here. So everyone, we hope you enjoyed the opening plenary. We're really looking forward to the next 3 days. Just a heads up on the afternoon keynote, which will feature a discussion between the 2021 Goularty Butcher Medal recipient, the Honorable Louise Arbor, and past recipient, Monica Pinto. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you soon.